Thank you, Kristen. It doesn't always happen that two people who are far away and very different in terms of their background, they talk by phone and become friends. And that's what happened with Kristen. But let me tell you a secret about that. Every last one of you could have that opportunity if you dare to say more than, hi, how are you? And what are you interested in? One of the things that I have been committed to all my life has been to bring people together who normally don't come together and find ways that they can connect so that there is some form of acceptance, not agreement, but acceptance. So it's a gift that everyone can have if they're willing to dare. And Kristen dared, and she doesn't know what she's got herself into. I'd like to start by telling you something about my background. There's no question that the way in which I look at things has been informed by family, by culture, by places that I've been. My father is an Afro-Latino. That means he is both African as well as Spanish. He joined the United States Air Force after graduating from high school because he wanted to get out of Puerto Rico and see the world. And he just happened to be stationed at the Air Base Scott, right across from St. Louis, and met my mother, who is from North St. Louis. She's African American, almost 100%, a little Irish, a little Cherokee. We could keep going. And they met and fell in love, got married, and stayed married for 26 years. And I came along at that time. Needless to say, when you have two people who come from very different cultures, there's all kinds of things that you see. But add to that, that he was in the Air Force. And because he spoke Spanish and a little Portuguese, he was used by the United States Air Force to train soldiers in Central and South America. Are you with me? All right, so we got stationed to places like Panama and 7 different states in the United States and Puerto Rico. So my life has been one of immersion in the world. And it's such, there were times when I was young that I looked at all that change in scene and I thought, I think I'd like to just stay one place and get to know everyone. And that would be wonderful. But I have to tell you, in retrospect, it's been the greatest gift that I could have gotten from them. So that's the first thing I want to say. Now I want to tell you how I became reverent of nature. It's important for you to hear my story before I start telling the stories of others. And so here's how it goes. When I was young, my dad would say things like, when we went out to the parks and we took our sandwiches and we had our picnics, he would say, when you're by a tree, think about how long that tree has been there and what it's seen. And he said, if you dare, talk to the tree. And I said, huh? I was about 8 or 9 years old, and it was like, oh God, my dad, everybody says my dad is different. Of course, I thought that because I was one of the few Black children with a father who spoke Spanish as well as English, with a mother who came from North St. Louis. So I was always already, to use the word that's become so popular, weird. And, and so, but it was in my head. I remember my mother having a green thumb, and everywhere we went, whether it was North Dakota, Massachusetts, Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, or in St. Louis, she had a green thumb. And I remember her talking about her childhood because she lived in the city, but would go out to the county to stay with her relatives there. Those that were in the county were in Meacham Park, and they had gardens, and she developed that whole gift of the green thumb. So everywhere we went, my mother had a garden, and that included North Dakota. So there you are, a father who talked about talking to trees, looking at how long they've been around, and I thought he was kind of weird. So stop that for a moment. I stopped and decided to go to St. Louis University after all that travel and all the exposure that I had. And I was confronted with the first time with the reality of racism. Why? Because in St. Louis, it's geographically divided in many ways, but those geographics also support racial division. Now, yes, there are areas where people are mixed, but by and large, it is still a segregated city. When I encountered that segregation, my heart felt so bad to meet others who had never been outside of a 15-mile radius of where they live. Now think about that for a moment. Never outside of a 15-mile, and in some cases, not more than 15 blocks from where they lived. And I thought, my God, how different the world would be for them. And I had empathy and care about that because of my own experience, and became very involved in social development with people who were economically disadvantaged. And that's my start. And then, of course, I went on and did other things. I taught at a community college for a while. I was head of a women's alternative center, women who got out of the federal penitentiary. I was very much of a social worker type, always trying to help the guy who didn't have the things that were there. And as life would have it, eventually I would decide that I would contribute given what I knew about the world. So stop for a moment. Here I am, kind of a Black professional wanting to do the best that I can. And I go to the park at Forest Park one day, and I'm walking in the park. My use of the park was not immersive. It was walking through and taking the benefits of being in the park, because there was a walkway, there were a lot of trees, but I didn't do what my father said. I didn't sit down and think about what were under the trees. That didn't happen. But in my life, a few years later, things started to happen where I felt that I was giving everything that I had to others. And I was pulling out all of my energy. I was becoming vacant. And so I had to back up, reevaluate. And so I decided to change what I was doing. This is after 20 years, so I'm moving fast on this. I decided to change what I was doing and move from social services to starting my own company that would provide employment and exploration for people who only lived in that 15-block radius, to help them to move into other areas. 20 years later, because I was a writer and always wanted to do that, I thought there's a larger arena where we can help people. And that is to have plays that deal with social issues, humanitarian issues, and deal with different cultures also. So that's where I went. This took me to a place where I had to travel to other countries to find the artists that I would bring. All right. And keep in mind, I had an international focus. I wanted to bring the world to St. Louis, to those who live within a 15-block radius. I wanted to open that up as well, to get others who had traveled to see these people too, because they were relatively invisible. So I started to research places I would go. And the first place that I thought of, because of my father, was Brazil. And there was an artist by the name of Virginia Rodriguez, who is amazing. If you ever have time, you can listen to her music and you'll love it. So that took me to Bahia and also to Salvador. And that is the largest concentration of slaves that were brought to the West anywhere. Largest number came to Salvador in Brazil. And I saw these people, I saw their joy. I met Virginia Rodriguez, who brought me into her home and told me about what she believed. And as it turned out, she was a part of a group, and some of you have heard of this, candomblé. These are people who religiously believe that, and they're from Africa originally, They believe that all life has spirit. And what did she do in the conversation that we had? She talked about how she loved talking to trees. I said, uh-oh. Uh-oh. So anyway, that happened. So let me just show you a couple of things here on the, I want to talk about my journey in relationship with nature. By the way, this picture was taken on the Amazon in Brazil, because I did take, there's no way I was going to go to Brazil and not go to the Amazon, right? Just beautiful and amazing. And I was on that boat, and the guide took me out on it, and he was telling me about the fish. And then, of course, he told me the piranha were out there. And I was very afraid of piranha, because I knew that piranha could take a cow and eat them up, in 30 seconds. Of course, I'm exaggerating about that. Needless to say, part of that experience allowed me not to walk through Forest Park and just take advantage of it, but to see it and talk to it. And this particular tree is a willow, beautiful, next to the water. And that's me when I was heavier, about 40 pounds heavier, and my hair was shorter and I was much younger. And my friend who was with me was taken by me watching this tree the way I did. And she thought it was kind of interesting, so she took the shot. Well, when she brought it home and I looked at it, I said, uh-oh, my dad told me that this would happen. Anyway, move on. Going to Brazil again, I was out on the boat with these other people. We fed the piranha rats, and probably rat meat. Probably the thing that bothered me the most was not the piranha, it was the rat meat. I could not put it on the hook. It was just, oh God, it was gross. But I was there with people from Germany and other places. And of course, I talked to all of them and asked them why they were there and on what basis. Had a wonderful time. I saw trees again, trees in the Rio Negro, steeped in the Rio Negro, going up as high as 6-story buildings. I had never seen anything like that before. And by the way, the Rio Negro, which means Black River, is black because of the richness of the soil that's there. And there are trees that grow up from the river up into the sky, and they are huge. And this is an example of them. And when I was out on that boat and I looked up at those trees, I thought about my father again. And I said, what would these trees tell me at this time? Move on. Then I went to Morocco. Why? Because there was an artist that I wanted to get who does music called Gnawa, Gnawa. And I said, there's no way I'm going to come to Morocco and not go to the Sahara Desert. Now, you might ask, what does water have to do with the Sahara Desert? And I'm going to give you the answer that a Black woman would give from St. Louis. I was on that desert for 3 days and never urinated. That was the most shocking to me. Why? Because the heat was so hot. And mind you, everybody goes with lots of water because they recognize that they're getting ready to go into a hot space. But the truth be told, when you're on the camel and you're in very hot weather, it goes. It's not there. And I even asked my friends who were with me, Berbers, I said, are you having this? And they laughed because I wondered if this was a problem I was having. By the way, again, I was about 40 pounds heavier. That was Coco. I have to tell you about Coco went in a private way after the show, because that was an exchange that is beyond belief. But it would take time to do that. What the Sahara did for me was to bring the issue of water right in front of me. First, by way of the way that my body reacted. And then second, to see how people, when they went to get the water, to get wet from that heat, enjoyed it so. And I was right by that fountain with the 2 Berber friends, And we just saturated ourselves in it. And you see, we're laughing and smiling. It was something about being together, talking to each other, and dipping into that cold water on that very hot desert that was glorious. And for a moment, I thought, I wonder if the water speaks. Not in words, but in feeling and emotion. Now, let me go back so that I can get to, I've told you about my journey and where I was. Now I want to share with you information about, can I ask you to hold this just for a second? Thank you. I didn't prepare myself well to have this open and speak at the same time. That's a problem when you're Black and you're Latin. You don't get it together right away. Why? Because you're moving and you're talking and you're blah, 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 blah. So that's part of our personality. So, and I've been around Germans, so I know how that reaction can come. Would you just slow down, please? I love Germans. That's why I studied them. As you look at this map, what I want you to think about is how I, as a Black woman, felt the need, because of being aware of nature in my life, going to these other places, including Brazil, how, of course, I would look at how this thinking developed with regard to the life force. Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you. With regard to the life force of nature. So I went back and I decided to look at the slaves who came to America and to South America. And one of the things that I recognized is that I knew the story of African slaves once they got to the United States. But I did not know the story of the Africans before they came. And it dawned on me that I was missing a great deal about who I am, who Black people are in America, without investigating this. So there are a few points. I won't give you a huge geographic history lesson, but I do want to talk about where they came from and what they believed. I want to get that light. The light again is right in the middle. Thank you. If you look at Mauritania, the lower part of Mauritania, and you follow it all the way down to Angola, right here, around this portion, that is where the vast majority of slaves came from. Now, obviously, it's because it's coastal, and that's where Europeans had access. What is interesting, there's like three major ways of looking at this area. One is a place called Senegambia, and it's called Senegambia because of the Gambia River and Senegal and some of the other areas that are right in that area. The other part of this is what they call West Central Africa. And then, of course, you've got this lower part of the West. Those three regions are the major regions that people who came to the United States, to South America and to the islands, they all came from that area. One of the things that I learned that was shocking, because I didn't know it before, is that slavery actually started in that region in the 1500s, right after Christopher Columbus discovered the United States. And it was Portugal that was coming into that area. And once Christopher Columbus came over, Portugal and other Europeans started to say, oh, you've got this labor force and we need to take advantage of it because we're doing some things in America. And so all of a sudden, after the 1500s, around the early 1700s, you really see that pickup from Europe, where Britain, England, and Spain and other European countries come to that area to get slaves. Now, what were the people doing there? There were very many cultures of their own within that area. Some of them, the Ashanti that you've heard of, the Ogu from Nigeria, also the Bantu. And each of them had their way of looking at the world. But there's something that they all had in common. And that was looking at nature as a life force, a real life force. Some would even say that there is a spirit to the water, there's a spirit to the trees. They looked at the water and the woods as the place of their ancestors. Now think about that for a moment. If that's the place of their ancestors, and ancestors are highly worshiped, they weren't looking at going to heaven. They were looking at joining their ancestors eventually in life. And if nature was the place for that to be, then of course they would hold it as sacred. And of course they would feel that they needed to handle nature in a special way. And so you find some of the groups in that area interpreting creation in that way. Some of the Bantu thought that they were a result of these waves that were moving, and suddenly out came the Bantu. There was a myth that was there. And others had their own, but always they gave to nature a life force. Now, going back to the enslavers who were there starting in the 1500s, there was interchange going on between people in this area when Europeans started to come. And what the Europeans did is the same thing that was done with Native Americans here in America. They basically started trading off. If you give me slaves, I will give you this item. And so we saw some of these countries, some people in these countries starting to engage in slavery themselves because of the trade-off that existed. After looking at that further, I also understood that actually when slaves came to the United States, some of them were already Catholic. Now, how many of you knew that? I did not know that. But they were, because the Portuguese forced their slaves, as did other Christians, to become Catholic. So by the time we started bringing slaves to America, there were Catholic slaves that came. I have to consult with St. Louis University folks about that because I'd never learned that. And that was something that was absent. I also learned that 1/5 of the slaves that came to the United States were Muslim, something I didn't know. And it's very likely, after doing some ancestry work on my own family, that some of my people came from Angola, and some of the DNA comes from there, and also from Mali, which is very interesting to me because guess what? The people that are thought to have come from Africa to the New World successfully, landing in Mexico, were the Malian seafarers. Amazing. And so those of you who know about Mexican history, there's a group called the Olmec, and their statues, and they're very, to use the anthropological term, Negroid. There's no question that those Olmec features are Negroid, and it's down in the area of Veracruz, and also a place called Ibano. Now, what's interesting about that? How many of you have heard the song La Bamba? Para bailar la bamba. Okay, I could do the rest of it. Get in trouble. That is not a Spanish word. That is African. And in Veracruz, if you look at the Mexicans who are there, they are dark. Straight hair, but dark. Yes. Put my mic back. All right. Okay. All right. So looking at that history was important. The other thing I learned is that these were not savages running around trying to figure out what they were going to eat the next day. They had rice culture. They had cattle culture. They made sorghum. They made coffee. They made ancient grains. They traded those off with the Portuguese. They got active in that effort. And it was transactional, learning about, what these foreigners wanted to do, getting products from them. And then, of course, the Europeans learning from them. In fact, it is said, and some dispute it, but it is said that in the United States, the rice industry could not be commercialized until they learned how some of these people did it in their homeland, such that it was prolific. So there was some appropriation of the knowledge of these people. The folks who came from the boat were not powerless people. They were made to be powerless, but their capability and their exposure, their savvy, their knowledge of, they didn't use the words preservation and conservation, was quite sophisticated. So in comes then the great Atlantic voyage, the taking of slaves to the United States. And now I'd like to go to the film. And what you're going to see is a description of what it was like to be on the slave ships. Now, some of you know this, but what I want you to pay attention to when you watch it is not just the data and statistics, but think about what this did to the people who love nature so much, who engaged in transactional work with Europeans, and suddenly find themselves on the ship for up to 2 months before they land. I want you to think about the impact of that when you see this. What do you think would be the thoughts of these slaves when they approached the land of America, of Brazil, of Haiti, wherever they went in the Western world, after having that experience over the water that they cherished, because for some of them, the water was the place of their ancestors? What would this trip, what impact would it have on them? What do you think? Horror? Okay. I can't hear you. They would certainly have second thoughts. Why is this happening to me when water was supposed to be the place of my people? That certainly would go through their minds. What else do you think? I'm sorry? Yeah, I think they would think that, absolutely. Although they might wonder what's going to happen when they're there. Huh? Yeah. Anyone else? Needless to say, when they came to America, this might be considered as the point in which there was trauma that would disrupt the way in which they looked at their reality. That would be the start of it. Now, that is not to say everyone felt that way. I bet you there were people who said to whatever Orisha or God that they worship, please, ancestors, please help me, because I know you to be a place where there is good. Help me, get me beyond this. I am sure that some retained their belief, but they had to struggle to do it, without a doubt. So there was probably mixed feelings. So now they get there, well, they get to America, let's take America, and they come in, let us say, through New Orleans, which was a popular place to bring many slaves. And then they're on the deck and someone is holding their hands up, they're pointing to what they look like after they've fed them a lot of rice and beans so that they could get built up again and look like they could do hard work. So as they stand there, they're looking at people, not understanding what they're saying. And they're seeing their mouths move and saying, look, that one, and not knowing exactly, and then they point to that person, then they see them walking. What goes through their minds, and this is the playwright in me trying to look at this from a human standpoint, from their standpoint. It was trauma, and the way they handled the trauma was different, and it was varied, but it was trauma nonetheless. So they came, and you guys know the story of how they were treated. I won't go through all of that. But the interesting thing about this that dawned on me, and I wonder what you think about it, I can imagine that once they got settled, once they understood what the routine was, and maybe the routine was picking cotton and then going back to the cabin and eating and then coming to pick cotton again. I've read accounts where there were masters who rang a bell when they were to get up in the morning, and they got them up at like 4 o'clock because they wanted to get some work out of them and give the motivation of getting breakfast 2 hours later. So they worked them 2 hours before breakfast. So they worked real hard, gave them breakfast, and then they came back and started working until sundown in many cases. I can imagine that once they hit the land and they were engaged in the farming, working on the land was the one thing that they knew that came from their own country. And in the oddest way, it was a place of familiarity. Is everyone following me with this? And that doesn't mean they were happy, not at all. But it means that they found whatever they could find to survive and feel comfortable. Interestingly enough, because the land in America was fertile, they were by water most of the time. So that kept them close to a source that they considered sacred, even though what they were doing and the way they were being treated was bad. Some, as you know, escaped to the woods, and they were very effective once they got into the woods and into the marshes, because many of their enslavers would not dare go in there because it was hard. I mean, you could go in the swamps and not get out of there. But these folks were very adept because they handled many kinds of environments in the area in which they lived in Africa. So they came with a view of the connectiveness of water, the land, and then the community. Because one thing that was true about Africans in all those areas, the land and the water was not something to be individualized. It was for the community. They had a communal view of it. So when they grew things, they grew it for everybody. But now, when they grew things, it was going somewhere to be sold on their backs. So that was very tough. So the question becomes, how did they adapt to that? And what effect did it have on them? And there's something that's said by an academic, her name is Camille Dungy, which I think is very helpful to look at. She says, even during the most difficult of times in African-American history, the natural world held potential to be a source of refuge, sustenance, and uncompromised beauty. It held that for them, even though it was hard to understand why it happened. By the way, Camille Dungy, who is an environmentalist and she is Black, wrote a book called The Story of a Black Mother's Garden, Soil. And she also edited a journal for many years called Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African-American Natural or Nature Poetry. So there's recognition that comes from later periods about the beliefs of those slaves about the soil and the land, and also their suffering. When they got here, again, the question is, where are my ancestors? What are they doing for me? And it did not always go well. For example, in 1803 in Georgia, there was a ship of Igbo people from Nigeria, 75 of them on a ship to be sold at $100 apiece. And as they were crossing the river, they decided to take it over and get away. And they killed their captors. And then they apparently, whatever they did with the ship made the ship come to the land, and they dismounted, and half of them just walked out to the sea until they drowned. Half of them. And they wondered, why did they do that? It was a curiosity because they were free at that point. They could have run into whatever. Of course, they didn't know where they would go because they had never been in that land before. But they opted to give their lives, not just because of the horror of it, but give their lives to their ancestors, the place that their ancestors came from. Is everyone following that? And then the other half escaped, and they don't know where they went. They never followed that up. But you can look at the Igbo tragedy in Georgia and read more about that. The interesting thing that happened is that when they heard the stories of Christianity, and most of them were illiterate, not all of them were, but some were, especially those who were Catholic. Some of them were literate, and even the Muslims who came as slaves were kind of used to the Quran. So when you talked about the Bible, they understood that there's a book that has knowledge that is important. And so they were able to kind of see that there might be some advantages to listening about that. But when they heard the stories of Moses coming through the river with the Jews miraculously to salvation, what do you think it sounded like? Of course, yes, it sounded like their own narratives. And they didn't have to read and write to remember that, because it resonated so much with their own history. And so what you find is an embrace of Christianity because of the hope that it gave to them. The hope, as they understood the God to be Jesus, rather than the names of some of their gods, it resonated. And we can see why they would give such an embrace to this thinking, because it gave them that big four-letter word, hope. And that's why they embraced it. But did that mean they got rid of the things that they believe? Oh, no. Some of them kept their practices, even in the midst of taking on and accepting what was said by those who were Christian. Now, I'm going to show a slide here on the baptism. Let me find. Oh, before I do that, let me go backwards again. Uh-oh. Okay, here we go. I want to make this point before I go to the baptism. The meaning of water to Black Africans, based on the stories you've just heard me say, was connection to ancestors, spiritual rebirth, harmony and balance within self and community. It symbolized purity and renewal, and the washing away of impurities and negative energy. So water, in every way that they experienced it, was not like me when I walk through the park and I enjoyed the walk, but I didn't see the trees. They saw the hope in their beliefs about water, and it was active right along with the Christianity that they were learning. Does everyone see that? See how that becomes a powerful form of hope? Now, this is a picture from Greenville, Mississippi, of Black folks being baptized. And you see how engaged they are and happy they are seeing that happen. Now, once again, think about where they came from and what the meaning of water is. They learned of the new hope, but they're coming back to the water that they understood to be the place of their ancestors, that they understood to be the grand purifier, that they understood that would give them balance. And so baptism for them provided fervor. Okay. Now, what I'd like to do is to, and I'm going backwards again. My thumb won't follow my instructions. All right, we're going to stop there. And there's another video I want to show you, but I want to give you a kind of introduction. There are places in the Americas where the exact form of practice to ancestral spiritual forces remains intact. And the center of that is in Brazil. It is interesting that the celebration of Iemanjá, which is the mother of the sea, is very popular in Brazil, but it also has moved into other parts of South America. When you see this very brief video, I want you to think about contrast and then think about the meaning of water that came from Africa. What contrast did you see in seeing that part? This is like just a couple of years ago. Anyone? What do you see in the contrast between the baptism in the water and what you see here, which is currently a demonstration of those that religion back in Africa, the religions back in Africa? Anyone comment? Parallels?
I don't know about contrast, but very similar celebrations, the celebratory immersions.
Okay, they are similar, certainly. And in what way are they similar? How do the people feel about it? Is it something they just go and have fun in the water, or you want to say something, but it's not? It's getting in there. There's a relationship, huh? There's an affection and embrace of the water. Now, yes. That's right. And they do see Iemanjá as the mother figure of their beliefs. And by the way, people in Nigeria, this religion is very similar to the Yoruba people who come from Nigeria. And Nigerians actually go to Brazil during these things because they want to see the way it was done years and years ago, because the isolation that occurred of the slaves in Brazil allowed them to retain the practice as it was. And so Africans come to Brazil to see what it looks like. I had the privilege of participating in a Iemanjá celebration and went to a candomblé session, which was one of the most amazing things I've ever done in my life. The reverence that people have. And yes, it is like another religion, and sometimes people get a little afraid of that. What I liked about it was the sincerity, and I liked where people went with that. In Brazil, they have terrible problems of climate, and yet they have people, because of this, that are very engaged because they don't want to see their forests destroyed. Some of the most courageous people are indigenous people who come from the Amazon forest themselves. Thank you. their love, their reverence. Now, I'm going to say something that might be controversial here, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't mind controversy. I think in this battle to get people more conscious about the environment, it is not to scare them to death. It is not to put them in a corner and say, you know, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, which is true. It is to find ways for them to have reverence for nature. Not necessarily in that way, but to love it and find ways to do, which means you've got to connect to people where they are to get them there. I've often thought, how could we get more people to engage in love of environment? And certainly some of you guys are already doing that. You're bringing people to go in your riverboat, kids that come on the boat and learn something about the river. It has a connection. But again, it's not just being on the river. It's knowing what the river does for it. It's knowing how good the river is to us. It's knowing that water is everything. If we had to get down to the root of the impact of climate change, the most significant root is what it will do to water. Because if water is destroyed or made minimal or not enough or contaminated, we're all done, right? But again, we're not scaring people that. Let's start with, do you know how much of your body is water? Do you know how water and the way in which you manage it in your body? Part of the reason I'm going to tell you this, part of the reason I lost weight is because I started drinking more water. I was not a water drinker. I know that sounds funny, but it's true. When we see relationships and the power of understanding the importance of water, we can take steps towards reverence. Now, there's some people that question, have we lost that reverence, particularly within the African American community? And I could see why some people would think that, because there are differences in regions and place that are different. Let's take the Great Migration. When people left the South because they were tired of being sharecroppers and making hardly any money to live, and they decided to go to the cities and take jobs that gave them 10 times the amount of money they were making as sharecroppers. Going to the city changed their relationship because their survival mode was different. In one way, it was advantageous. In another, it was not. But they did it. Some of those people, if they had their own property, made gardens, grew food. One of the most amazing experiences I had, and I'm going to move over a little bit to a more current time frame. A family that I work with from Liberia. The mother walked her 2 kids from Liberia to Cote d'Ivoire in order to engage in a, for lack of a better word, a lottery to come to the United States. You drew a number, and if your number was called, you got to come. And I heard about their story. The mother's child that she carried was about 8, but it had some kind of, she had some kind of physical affliction. And so when the child and the mother were in the refugee camp, they looked at her as being expendable because they did not think she was going to be normal and survive. So they did not give her food. They did not give her medical care. They gave medical care to people who were more capable of making it. And she died. Her name was Anita. And Sunita, who is the sister of this little girl with her mother, got the lottery 3 days after the daughter died. They came to St. Louis on a plane, something they had never been in. but they will tell you that when they were in the plane, they said the sky belongs to God and we're in his care. It was their God, but that's what they did. And they did the plane thing. Got to St. Louis within 6 months to a year. She had worked, had found a house that she could rent to buy, and they invited me over for dinner. And the dinner included food that they had made in their backyard. And she said, come and see my yard. That backyard was narrow and about as long as this room, and maybe to that, that arc. Not very long, but it was covered everywhere with different kinds of foods that they were making, a lot of green things. And I looked and I was amazed. And she was so proud. She walked, yes, this is, I didn't know what half the stuff was. And the food was magnificent. And I was amazed, but she held on. That soil that was becoming hers, she made into a garden. She was working in a cleaners. Her daughter went to school, happened to come into a program that I sponsored that brought African-American kids, white kids, and immigrants and refugees together to learn about each other. And the program used the arts to teach them leadership skills and also about each other. So we took the kids to the garden so they could see what this mother had done. And the Black kids say, what? What? Did you guys do this? And one guy said, man, look at all the money you could save if you had this. It was magical to see their reaction to what this woman had done, who came from another country and lost her child. And she said, it's God, and gave him the hose to hose all the plants, the water that nurture the plants. Now, Sunita, and I'll just say this quickly, Sunita Manu today has a PhD in public health policy. Sunita Manu is at Washington University, and education was one of the most important things in her life. And when she had her first child, she told me that she was going to name her either Yemanya, which is the goddess of the sea, or she was going to name her Joy. And I said, that's a big difference, Yemanya and Joy. She says, well, she now goes to a Lutheran church, and joy was something she heard in the music. And so she decided Joy Yemanja Lom is the name. So unbelievable in terms of how water mingles in there and provides strength and love to other people. How are we on time? By the way, just so I don't see a clock, and I'm sorry. And I can talk. Okay. Okay. Let's move on with the slides. Now, going back to the influences of the water, this is a true story right here in Missouri. During the pre-Civil War and Civil War, in the state of Missouri from about 1845, 1847, it was against the law to educate slaves and freedmen. If you did it, you'd be put in jail. And that was a fact. But there was one Black guy who bought his own freedom. His name was John Barry Meacham, who was a carpenter. And he took an old steamboat, fixed it up, put desks in it, bought books, and he sailed it on the Mississippi for 300 Black kids to learn to read and write. It was a place of freedom. Why? because the Mississippi was under federal jurisdiction. And the Missouri sheriffs couldn't come and get the kids. Can you believe that? So literally, the river became a place of freedom for those kids. And there's some pretty impressive people who came from that, one of whom is James Milton Turner. And if you ever get a chance to read about him, he would become kind of the superintendent of schools for Black kids in the state of Missouri. And eventually he would become a representative, I think for Liberia or something like that. Very well-educated man, smart man. But he went to that boat. The river provided freedom for that education. It also provided opportunity. When a slave and a freedman saw the steamboats, it was like, I'd love to get a job there because then I can meet people. And yes, I'm a slave even there, but I can make contacts and just maybe I can escape. So the idea of being on the river literally provided freedom for many people because they wanted to get away from the confines of the small farm and not being able to move around and meet other people. So the river remained very, very important. Now, something magical happened when the war started. As you well know, during the last year of the Civil War, maybe a year and a half, Abraham Lincoln decided that he would admit colored soldiers. That did not happen at first because there was a concern that the Confederates would be agitated, that Blacks would be brought into the military. But Frederick Douglass, who had the ears of Abraham Lincoln, who of course is the biggest Black abolitionist of our time, he convinced Abraham Lincoln to allow the soldiers to fight. And so they did start segregated units of former slaves and freedmen. But they also had a Navy. How many of you knew that there was a Union Navy? Okay, I didn't until about 10 years ago. In that Union Navy were 20,000 former Black slaves that chose the river to fight for their country because they knew that by fighting on the river, they'd have a winning chance to help. And they loved the work and did very well. There's a lot of discussion about how they actually helped. This is a picture of some of those Black Navy men who fought in that space. Again, still segregated, but for them, it was freer than what they had. Amazing to hear about their stories as well. And they were very helpful to the captains and lieutenants with their knowledge of the area. And so they were able to tell them where Confederates might be hiding and to what extent, because they knew that territory really well. So that was very important. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So after the war, we move into Reconstruction, and past Reconstruction, we move into the period in which race becomes a very loud voice. And we see here a man trying to get what? Water. And the water is segregated. It's water for colored people and water for white people. And so the use of water continues not to be what the Africans knew that it was at one time. So it raises the question, where are we now? What can we do? What's on the agenda beyond the history of these people? For me, it was important for you to know that history because you begin to see what the character is of the people. If I told you that the Pew Research Center did a study of groups and their relationship to religion, and they found that Black Americans have the highest degree of enthusiasm of the general public. Would you be surprised? Some of you are not saying. Many people were surprised, including Black people. So let me just say that. And here's what I think. This is not scholarly. This is just this little person's opinion. By learning reverence for water and nature and holding on to that in a way that allowed them to get through, to see the stories of Africa and then see the same hope stories in Christianity, and to eventually go from what they knew to be the experience on the ships to a point in which they had some control on their destiny, not total control, and certainly still with a great fight to do. I understand the level of energy that has been, and enthusiasm that has been put out. You should read that study because it's incredibly fascinating. So where do we go from here? Well, the first thing I want to say is that for anyone who thinks that there are not Black environmentalists, hold on. There have been environmentalists from the beginning. Not to the degree that we all would like to see, but they've been there. And I want to tell you about a few of them, because when I did the research on this, I was really surprised. Sequoia National Park. Guess who the first superintendent was? The one who removed all the stuff and preserved the trees and made it the park that it is. Anyone know? I'm waiting. Anyone know who it is? And I'm also trying to find it too. I'm sorry. This old lady can't remember everything. All right, here we go. Charles Young. Charles Young was the son of a slave, and he himself was a slave. And his father joined the Union Army. That's what got him free, because many people who were slaves were given freedom by joining the army. And he went to West Point. He was the third African-American ever to go to West Point back then. That surprised me because I didn't even know that West Point was around then, but it was. So he went to school, he got educated, and he became the first Black parks superintendent, and it was of Sequoia Park, which I have been to. And you talk, I was so overwhelmed because I wanted to talk to every tree. I was, no, I'm teasing. George Washington Carver, everybody knows about him, right? Tell you something to show you what the caliber of this man is. First of all, he was brilliant, and he did way more than deal with peanuts. I can tell you that, and I'll tell you a few things in just a moment. But I want you to hear what he put down in a lecture that he gave to Black students about agriculture. And listen to what he said. When you hear this, I want you to think about what you now know about the reverence that Africans had for nature, okay? So here we go. Unkindness to anything means an injustice done to that thing. If I am unkind to you, I do you an injustice or wrong you in some way. On the other hand, if I try to assist you in every way that I can to make a better citizen and in every way to do my very best for you, I am kind. The above principles, my students, apply with equal force to the soil. Isn't that something? That's what that man said. What a teacher he was. And by the way, I told you he was brilliant. Here's how brilliant he was. Henry Ford wanted to do something with rubber, and I don't know the whole story. You can research this yourself. And he hired George Washington Carver to help him understand how he could get there. And he worked with Henry Ford for a number of years. Stalin, Stalin from Russia, offered George Washington Carver a position to head agriculture in Russia. He, of course, turned it down. Isn't that something? There's so much more about him. There have been many environmentalists. And one thing has been said about them that hit me here, that most of them are people who themselves are close to nature. The superintendent of Sequoia was out there doing the work. George Washington Carver worked with the farmers directly on their farms, showing them how to do it and then also teaching them. They have always been people who were not necessarily bureaucrats, but they were people working with the land itself. That's a hint, I think, of another approach to getting more people involved, particularly minority communities. Now, I do want to read one last thing, and then I'm open to questions. And actually, I'm not going to read that. I'm going to read the following. I've changed my mind on that. I'm going to read The Negro Speaks of Rivers. How many of you have heard of that? The Negro Speaks of Rivers. That's by a Missourian who is known as one of the top poets of the Harlem Renaissance. His name was Langston Hughes. And he was only 17 years old when he wrote this poem. And think about rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. That's the end of my talk. Okay, I'm here for questions as long as Steve will have me. We're okay? All right, questions?
Trevor and I do have mics, and we will chase you down. And
oh, come on now. I know you do.
Really?
Come on. Yes.
goody.
Oh, I love that you remember that. She wanted to know about the camel because I said I would talk about it later. That's so funny. That says a lot about you too, by the way. First of all, when I went out, to get to the Sahara, we drove in a Jeep on the Atlas Mountains. And the Atlas Mountains have to be one of the highest mountains ever. I think you'll find that the altitude is off the charts. When I looked down at some of the villages that were below, it looked like ants. That's how high up we were. But anyway, to make a long story short, we got to the camp where we would then ride camels for the next 3 days. And I was in a tent, scared to death, because I looked at them and my friends had scared me and they said, oh, you know, they spit at you and they might bite you and they do this and that. And so I couldn't sleep that night because I was thinking about being on the camels. And one of the things that I noticed is that they were not far from my tent. And because I couldn't sleep, I kind of came out and looked at them. There's 3 of them. And they had the longest eyelashes. And one of them looked at me and went, And being the city girl that I am, I said, oh, I hope it's not that camel. And anyway, one of the, on a side here, when I came out, for the first time, I had an experience I'd never had before. And that is that I could see stars eye level. Imagine being in a space where you can see stars eye level. So I'm looking at the stars and I'm looking back, and I'm still thinking, which one am I going to be on? And I thought it could be him because he was big. And at that time, I was a heavy woman. And I said, yeah, surely they're going to put me on him. And I thought, oh, Lord, you give me the strength to do what I've got to do with this. So anyway, the next day after we had our goat's milk and tea and the other stuff that we had, we got on the camels and I had the smallest one there. But he wasn't the small, I mean, it's not like he was small. He was just the smallest one of the three. And his name was Coco. So we go in the desert and we're riding. And, you know, when you're on a hump like that, you're bouncing constantly like this. And I said, oh, Lord. So anyway, I'm on this Coco. And I would talk to Coco. I said, Coco, we're going to make it, honey. Yeah, you got this urban Black woman, but we're going to make it, you know. And so there was a moment in which we were going kind of slow, and the guys in front of me got off on a dune, and I was far enough from them that they could not really see me. And the reason that I needed to stop is because I had to urinate and I had no place to do it. And the only way you could do it was be far enough away from them that you can go. I had all my paraphernalia, so I hid behind his hump. So so nobody, this is the truth. So nobody would see me. And of course, that went very fast. And all of a sudden, he got up and he ran up to them and left me there. He left me. So then I don't know what the Berber guy told him, who was in blue, silk blue, but he came back. He came back to me and he got down on his knees for me to mount him. And I mounted him and we were best friends from then on. And this is the God's truth. I went to Virginia Beach when I came in from Europe back to the United States. I came through Virginia Beach into a hotel, not a hotel, but a restaurant that was very close to the airport. And in the restaurant, there's a picture of a camel. And I thought, oh my God, it's like the tree. They talk to you. So that Coco is, which is very sweet to me. I love that. I often wonder where Coco is now. Anyway, other questions? Yes. No, I'm afraid not. I'm semi-retired, believe it or not. And so I've not been pushing plays much, but the play that I want to show again is the play about the shared experience of Germans and African Americans in Missouri. That's the one I want to do. The problem with plays is that they're cost intensive. And you almost have to have a tour of 9 to 10 shows in order to raise the money to pay for it. So with that being the case after COVID and a number of other things, what I started to do is to do kind of mini dramas. And one of the things I did at Lincoln was a 30-minute portion of that play that talked about Judge Arnold Krakel and Lincoln University. So I'm doing smaller things now because it's just not cost effective. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
One of the things I've been thinking about leading up to your presentation is a little bit of my own experience working with minority students. And at the time I worked for the National Park Service, and they were doing a diversity recruitment program, and we would take these young people and help them work on their sort of elevator speeches of their sort of relationship or connection to nature. And it's been so interesting from something that was happening maybe 15 years ago with people younger than me. I'm still young, I think. uh, that the stories they told about their connection to the environment often started with white college professors or a white scout leader. And being Black or brown, it was interesting to me to think about how in the environmental movement, how sort of white people define outdoorsy or environmental, or if you're a conservationist. And now that I've seen these once young people become leaders now in the environmental movement, their stories have changed. They don't start with the white college professor. They start with my grandmother's stoop in New Jersey, and she used to grow herbs and plants, and every single plant she could fill onto that stoop. And so I hear a lot of similarities in what you shared tonight in their kind of own journey I've watched with a group of students, I had once a long time ago. And one particular student we just shared on our Facebook page, his name's CJ Golding, that he went on a 4-day canoe trip on the Missouri River with another group of younger Black adults, and sort of talking about that experience on the Lewis and Clark expedition and what York's experience would have been like and how much he contributed to that expedition. And I just trying to think of how to add a question in here.
Well, I can say that you've made a very powerful observation, and let me paraphrase it and let me know if I got your point. What I hear you saying is that they may have started with head knowledge about the environment, but they landed with knowledge that applies to community.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
And remember, the way it starts with Africans from the very beginning is that the land and the sea and all of this is community. The community is the most important. And when you start from community and you go backwards to knowledge that allows you to be competent in the environmental movement, that's very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the key is that that doesn't get destroyed. That people, when they hear a young Black environmentalist talk about, well, I want to do this with my community and blah, 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 and if it doesn't quite fit exactly into what a person may want, if it fits in the overall picture and it's starting from community, you can build to the other places, but you have to be patient. You have to show the relevance to community. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So kind of what I hear you saying is that maybe sometimes when we're talking about the environment, we don't make a separation between us
and
like,
them and what's important to them. That's right.
Yeah.
Really, see, that's why I like you, Kristen. What the heck, my goodness. Half of it we've already figured out.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, other questions? Well, I have enjoyed you guys. Thank you so much. I want to share with you a friend of mine who is here. This is Adelia Parker Castro. She is from Montgomery City. She's an artist and involved in lots of stuff. She has one of the most incredible gardens that I have ever seen, and has been that way for years. And I appreciate her so for taking this journey with me. So we thank you, Steve. You guys are amazing. And I'll just say this, if you had not chosen to come out of your comfort zone and talk to someone who was doing something totally different than where you are, we would not be here now. So there's a lesson that comes from that. Don't reach out to just to the familiar, but reach out to people who are different than you. Each of you got a bookmark which is my little contribution to you. And it talks about co-creation and the power of co-creation and how problems and needs can be solved if we do it together and bring diverse teams together, not just in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of knowledge, in terms of place, bringing rural and urban and Black and white and Latino and scientists as well as conservationists. When we do that, we get to a higher